We are on, so good evening. It's good to see everybody. Those that are online with us, appreciate you being with us. I hope everybody had a chance to get outside and play in the nice weather today, all right? I did not get to, so I've had some folks rubbing it in the wound that I didn't get outside. So we're glad that you're here. We're glad to have the Higgins with us, a young couple of missionaries, and they are with over at Miles Straight Baptist Church, but they're with us tonight, so we're glad to have them with us, as all of you that are here. And I'm also glad to know that the days are getting longer. Have you noticed that? Yeah, I'll be glad when President Trump changes all that stuff and throw that stuff out. He should have included that in the executive orders, is what he should have done. They missed one. He ran out of pen? Yeah. All right, so let's get into our Bible study this evening. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 13. 1 Samuel 13, and you have your outlines with you, and we'll get into that. So keep in mind that as we've made our way from chapter 9 through chapter 12, all introducing us to Saul. And he, unbeknownst to him, one day out looking for some lost donkeys, ends up having this encounter with Samuel the prophet, and told he's going to be king and is anointed to be king and so forth. And then we see how that after he's anointed as king and proclaimed, Jabesh Gilead that was attacked by Nahash. Saul rises up and he takes on a leadership role. And then, of course, last week we saw in chapter 12 his coronation, and of course the message that Samuel had to the nation that, look, how we got here was not the way God intended. It was because basically your hard-heartedness, you reject God as your king, you want a king like the nations, so you've got it, okay? And that brings us to chapter number 13. But here's one of the things that we've mentioned as we've made our way through, especially in chapter 11 with Jabesh Gilead, and then of course chapter 12 and so forth. We've seen some really good qualities come out in Saul. It's kind of like, you know, and remember that one of the things that we're told was that God changed his heart. And it was evident that he had a changed heart. And he was really doing well. And we've talked about how that Saul was off to a good start. And God was doing everything, giving him every opportunity to succeed, even though he didn't come to be king, or he would not necessarily have been God's choice. But that's what Israel wanted, and so he's basically giving them what they want. But what we've said all along is that thus far he's been doing really well. God is giving him every opportunity and everything he needs to succeed. So he had started well. But you know, the key to once you start well in life, or in a certain direction, or a particular mission, or whatever it may be, what do you have to do day in and day out? You start well, but you have to do what day in and day out? You've got to continue well. You've got to make good choices. And so starting well, continuing well, maintaining that, growing in it day by day, ultimately coming to the end of ending well, is all about what happens from day to day. Thus far, early on with Saul, we've seen him doing really well. But all of a sudden, we come to chapter 13. And this is where things really begin to change with Saul. This is where we find Saul not consistently making good choices. And it sets the tone for what comes ahead in his career as king of Israel. So we're going to start in chapter 13, beginning in verses 1 and 2. The first thing we'll talk about is that Saul is established as king of Israel. I want you to kind of hang on to that word there, established. But basically what we have here is that it says in chapter verse 1, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And then it says the rest of the people he sent away, every man to his tent. So basically when I say Saul is established as king of Israel, he's kind of starting to get a good feel, getting his government started. Here he finally develops a standing army. He develops a regular army. He has men that are enlisted and they're appointed to be soldiers in his army, which is one of the primary responsibilities that you have as a king, a ruler, leader, a president, governor, and so forth and so on. Now notice it says that that Jonathan was in Gibeah of Benjamin. Now sometimes that's also called Geba. But now there's another area that sometimes was used for as Geba, and you're going to see that in just a few moments, all right? But Gibeah of Benjamin is Saul's hometown, and it ultimately becomes the base, the headquarters of his kingdom, okay? So that's where Jonathan is. Saul is at a place off to the northwest, or northeast rather, in Michmash. So just to make the point that his king, he's established his king, appoints his army. Then we come to verses 3 through 7, where Saul's army attacks the Philistines. It says, and Jonathan, and so Jonathan, of course, is his son. Now, if you look down at verse number 16, that's where Jonathan is identified as being the son of Saul. He's one of the commanding officers in Saul's army, in fact, likely right next to his father, ruling in the army. And so it says, and Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba. Now there's that word again, okay? There are two different areas that use that name. Gibeah sometimes was called Geba. Then there's another place called Geba, and it was about 5 miles northeast of Jerusalem, and Gibeah was a little bit further to the east as well. But anyway, so Jonathan attacks the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines heard of it. Now, one of the things we want to talk about just a moment with Jonathan is this, that we know from the remainder of the book of Samuel that Jonathan was a good man. Jonathan becomes a best friend, confidant of David, looked out for David, even protected him from his father. We know that Jonathan was an excellent soldier, an excellent military officer. And so here he is, he's leading this attack on the Philistines. Now, knowing what we know about Jonathan from the rest of the book of Samuel, it's not likely that he on his own went and made this attack. So the implication of it is most likely he is acting under orders from his father, okay? So he is acting under orders. He goes to attack the Philistines there in Geba, and here's what he's doing. The reason why he's being ordered to go and to attack them is that basically what you've got going on is that Israel, in a lot of ways, is still living under the kind of things they experienced in the book of Judges. Remember that? If you remember when we started in 1 Samuel, we made the comment that with him being the final judge, the period of Judges and Samuel all overlaps. So what you've got is a situation where in certain areas the Philistines still have their foot on the neck in many ways on some of the Israelites. And that's what was going on here. There was this stronghold, this garrison of the Philistines. Now think about that. They have a stronghold still in the land of Israel. And one of the things we need to remember is this. We have to be careful and make certain that we don't allow strongholds to become established in our life. What is a stronghold? Well, it's where the enemy gets rooted and it's hard to get them out. That's why we have to be careful about opening any doors to Satan in our life and so forth. Otherwise, he can come in and establish a stronghold even as a believer. But here's what was going on with Israel. Still certain pockets of Israel, they were living in peace only as long as they did as the Philistines wanted them to do. As long as they were subject to the Philistines, there was no problem. So what this attack is intended to do is to go and punch the bully in the nose. So they're under order, he's under orders by Saul to go and attack the garrison of the Philistines, this stronghold, to say that we're not going to take it anymore. This is going to stop. And so it stirs up a hornet's nest, so to speak. Then it goes on and says in verse number 16, then Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. In other words, be aware of what's going on, that this attack is going on against the Philistines. Verse 4, and all Israel heard it. Now all Israel heard it, said that Saul had attacked a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had also become an abomination to the Philistines. So Jonathan's under orders to go and to attack the garrison of the Philistines, and it's made clear here that Saul is the one that's really behind it, given the order, and that when they go and they attack them, that the Israelites become an abomination to the Philistines. Now, why do you think that description is being used? Why would the Philistines look upon Israel now as an abomination? What's going on? They're not bowing down anymore. The Israelites are fighting back. As long as the Israelites didn't push back on them, everything was fine. Now that they're giving some pushback, they're looking at them like they're an abomination. And then it says in verse number 4, the latter part of it says, and the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. Now remember, that's where he was. His coronation as king took place. He was at Michmash. So if you remember where Jerusalem's located, Gibeah's over here, Geba, where the Philistine garrison, is over here. Michmash, where Saul was at, was not far from that, but it was up in the hill country and the mountains. So Saul comes down into the valley to Gilgal, and he calls the people of Israel together. He calls the rest of his army to meet with him in Gilgal. Verse 5, then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots. Better translations actually say 3,000. 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So what is that phrase, as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude? What is that implying about the army of Israel or the Philistines? What? A lot of people are coming to this fight. Okay? There's a lot of folks coming to the fight. And they came and they encamped in Michmash, where Saul had been, but he has vacated it. Verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, that is west over to the Transjordan, where the 2.5 tribes were located. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Now make note of that. And remember that the people following him are basically those that he summoned to meet him at Gilgal, and most of them would have been that standing army that he has put together. But don't forget the statement, they were trembling. All right, remember that. And remember, they're all running to the caves and the rocks and so forth and so on. Now, that brings us to verses 8 through 16. And we really get to the heart of what's going on in this chapter, because here you see that Saul is tested. Really what's going on? God in his sovereignty is allowing this to transpire because this is a test for Saul. Remember what I said as we got started? Saul has been doing really well up until now. He's been making good choices. Here's going to be a critical test about whether or not he can continue to walk in that, continue to do well consistently. Look at verse number 8. It says that then he waited 7 days, that is, Saul waited 7 days in Gilgal, according to the time set by Samuel. So the implication of what's going on here is this: when Saul sent out that call, come to me at Gilgal, there was also a call for Samuel to come. Samuel had sent word and said, I will be there in 7 days. So Saul's at Gilgal, waiting on people to gather. He's waiting on Samuel to come 7 days, all right? But then it goes on and says this: but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Now think about a couple of things right here. The people were scattered from him. Well, who is him? Saul. So when it says the people were scattered from him, what is it saying to us? What have they done? They've retreated. They've run. Saul basically, essentially, has been left alone in Gilgal under this threat, this hornet's nest that's been stirred up with the Philistines, all right? And so he's alone. And Samuel is delaying. Now let me ask you the question. Samuel had said, I'll be there in 7 days. 7 days have gotten there. In Saul's thinking, Samuel's not coming. Well, Samuel's a prophet of God. If he says, I'm going to be there in 7 days, Samuel's a man of his word. He's going to be there. Why is Samuel delayed? It's a test. It is a test to see what Saul will do, whether or not this change has really gotten deep down into his soul. If what he has done thus far, and he's done well, can he go even deeper and further with that? And so the 7th day is there, it's getting late, and Samuel has not shown up. Now here's the thing, here's what it is. This is the test for Saul. Does he have the faith and confidence to have patience? Take Samuel, the man of God, take his word, believe what he says. Does he have the self-discipline, the self-control, not to panic, not to make rash decisions? It's a test about whether or not he can simply obey, because basically Samuel's saying, I'll be there in 7 days. Samuel is saying, you wait on me. Can he obey the prophet's command? And does he have respect for God's order of things? Because the whole idea of what Samuel was going to do, and the plan is for Samuel to come, offer a sacrifice, lead them in worship of God. Does Saul have the respect for God's order of things and the office of priesthood? What will he do if Samuel doesn't show up? It's all a test. Verse 9. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he finished presenting the burnt offerings that Samuel came. The 7th day is not over. And Saul went to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? So let me ask you the question. What has Saul just done?
He went out, he didn't wait for Samuel. Samuel was to do the burnt offering.
He demonstrated that all those qualities that I was talking about earlier, that in order for him to continue to do well and to be able to run well and finish well, patience, self-discipline, obedience, respecting God's order, could he abide by that? What was the answer? No. He just proved he could not. And Samuel says, what have you? And here's the thing. The real issue here was Saul presumed to take upon himself a privilege and a function that was not his to take. Saul said, verse 11, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed. Yeah, he did. 7th day's not over with. And that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash. Then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and parentheses, and I am alone, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Now listen to this. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. Now, focus on that term he uses here, that statement, the phrase, I felt. I felt compelled. What does that communicate about Saul? If he felt something, he acted upon it. What does it say? What's it saying about him?
He's not praying to God about it.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah, he's acting on emotion. That's what's going on. I was afraid, and so I felt like I needed to offer this sacrifice in order so that I can get God on my side and get God's favor. But the point is, he acted out of emotion. He acted out of fear. He acted out of the fact that he was alone. He panicked. We could even go to so far as to say he acted out of a sense of relativism, which is a real issue and problem in our culture today. And it's a problem in the church. What do we mean when we talk about relativism? What does that mean? Can anybody define that for me? What does it mean? What does relativism mean?
It's true for you, it's not true for, might not be true for you.
Yeah. Or whatever God says and commands, well, that might apply to somebody else or how it applies to them, but it doesn't apply to me. Everything's relative. I can tweak it as I need to suit my desires. Yeah, I feel like this. And that's what was going on with him. So this stuff we deal with in the 21st century, it's not new, right? And by the way, let me ask you a question. Would you dare say that most people that you know act out of faith, wisdom, knowledge, understanding of the Word of God? Or do they act out of their emotions, out of fear, out of their own relative perspective? Not everybody, but I'm telling you, there's a whole lot of folks, even believers, that's how they're oriented. That's how they make their decisions. Entitlement, okay? Verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, now I want you to listen to this, because remember how Saul came to be king and how God had said, look, and we've mentioned this a number of times, that the Lord made it known in the book of Deuteronomy that there would be a time where Israel, as it developed, where there would be a king that would serve over Israel, but it would be a king of God's choosing, with the heart that God wanted that person to have, okay? And so we know none of that's true about Saul, and yet God has given him every opportunity to be successful, all right? So keep all that in mind. Verse 13, and Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. Now listen to this. For the Lord would have established, now I said a minute ago as we got started, the first point was that Saul had established his kingdom. So he's gotten some government things and people in place to the point now to where he was free to establish an army and have a regular army standing and so forth. That was him as king. Notice what Samuel says right here. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. Listen to this. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Isn't that amazing? Even given the fact about how all this came about because Israel wanted a king like the other nations, and God said, if that's what you want, okay, that's what I'll give you. But even with that, God was willing to give him the opportunity if he would just show that he had a heart for God and he would obey God and continue to run well, that God would have established his kingdom forever. Man, that's grace. But it was not to be because of the choices that Saul made. verse 14, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And Saul had an opportunity to be that man. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Saul failed the test, and proving he did not have. So he had been moving in that direction, but here he's proving that he's going in a different direction now. He had the opportunity. Isn't it amazing that, and this is true in our life as well, we all make choices. My goodness, you think about all the choices we make in a day. I think about just on some days the choices and decisions I have to make in an hour. But you think about the choices we make in a day. And all those choices have consequences, cumulative effect, good, bad, so forth and so on. But think about this. There are some choices that we make, just some single individual choices that we make, that can literally impact our life for the rest of our life and even beyond. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's a powerful thing when you think about the power of making a choice. Verse 15, then Samuel arose and he went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people present with him, about 600 men. And then we come to verses 16 through 23, and we see where Saul's army is demoralized. Verse 16 says, Saul, Jonathan his son, and the people present with them remained in Gibeah of Benjamin. But the Philistines encamped in Michmash. So the Philistines had moved into a place where Saul once was at with some of his army. Then raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines of 3 companies. One company of the Philistines turned on the road to Ophrah. I wonder if she had a television show. Had to throw that in there. Another company turned to the road to Beth Horon, and another company turned to the road of the border that overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. So they stirred up a hornet's nest. And so now the Philistines are going out on raids against the Israelites. Verse 19. Now listen to this. It says, now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears. This is the kind of upper hand and oppression that they had on Israel, where they had shut down the blacksmith among the Israelites. For what reason? They can't make weapons of war. They can't make any. They can't even sharpen their axes and their hoes. But all the Israelites would go to the Philistines to sharpen each man's plowshare, his mattock, his axe, his sickle, and the charge for sharpening was a pim. Now that translates to 2/3 of a shekel. In today's currency, because I looked it up, in today's currency, a shekel is equal to 27 cents. 2/3 of that is 18 cents. And that's not much this day and age, but in that day, that was pretty serious money. And so that's what they charge for the plowshares, the mattocks, the axes, and to set the points of the goads. And as I said, they're still experiencing much of what went on and transpired during the period of the judges. Verse 22, and so it came about on the day of battle that, now listen to this, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and Jonathan, his son. So remember, I said a minute ago, remember the statement that said that all of the people were trembling? Now you know why. They had no weapon. The only weapons of war were found with Saul and Jonathan, the royalty. Even the people in the army did not have any swords. They're having to fight with sticks and clubs and wooden pitchforks, whatever the case may be. and going up against a well-equipped army, the Philistines and so forth, and a very skillful military. And so the only ones who had anything were Saul and Jonathan. And then, of course, verse 23, we conclude with it, says, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash, meaning that they didn't not only lose territory, they gained territory. Territory where Saul had occupied and his soldiers. They kept their original territory. They took the territory that Saul had vacated when he left with his army, not to mention the raiders that had gone out throughout Israel. And so the order that Saul gave to go and start this skirmish was not a very good decision. And even though he had contacted Samuel about coming, and Samuel was going to come and meet them, something that I noticed early on, and you probably noticed, nowhere in there do you find that before Saul gave the commandment to go out and to do this, what did not take place?
God didn't tell him to do it.
No prayer? God didn't tell him to do it? Which again is another indication that Saul, though he had started well, was starting to go down another track. And chapter 13 and 14 really open up and show us the cracks that are starting to take place in Saul's life and in his kingdom. And we'll pick up with that next week. Now, all right, any questions, thoughts, anybody? Yes, ma'am.
They're kind of abstract questions, but when you're saying that God has already chosen, well, God chose Saul. I mean, Saul went out looking for donkeys. He wasn't saying, I want to be a king, So, I don't know, I'm just kind of like, God chose Saul. So, is that like predestined kind of thing going in there? Or?
Well, here's the thing. It kind of goes back to the idea that, so the question for those that are online, the question is that God chose Saul, but what he chose was the kind of king and the kind of man that Israel wanted. Okay? Because what we learn about Saul early on, and we find this in chapters 8 and 9 early on, Saul didn't even know who Samuel was when he saw him. Didn't even recognize him. Samuel's the prophet of God. Saul didn't even have a clue who he was. Went up and asked him, can you tell me where the prophet is? I'm right here in front of you, dude. Okay? Didn't even know who he was. Saul was a secular man. Saul was not a spiritually minded man. And he was tall, handsome, fit the perfect description of the kind of king that they wanted. So God gave them, what he chose was the kind of man that they wanted as a king. But with that, there again, we come back to the whole theme of grace. God still intervened and worked in Saul's heart, changed his heart. And at first, Saul was doing great. But it's like I heard a preacher, there was an old preacher years and years ago, preach a sermon on the Egyptians chasing the Israelites and down to the Red Sea and everything. And it's an old black preacher. And the title of his sermon was, Old Enemies Pursuing. Old enemies are always pursuing. Saul's old enemies of his old nature and ways of doing things was always pursuing. And Saul had to make a choice of whether he was going to continue on the path that God, by his grace, had pointed him on, even though he was not really the guy God wanted, the kind of guy God wanted for Israel. And Saul had to make a choice. It's like we come back. He started well. By God's grace, he had every opportunity to succeed, even to the point that right here we just saw where God said, where Samuel said, the Lord would establish your kingdom forever if you'd have just stayed on the right path. Even though you're not the guy he originally had in mind, God in his grace gave you the opportunity. But Saul chose to go back to old ways. All right. Any others? All right. All right, thank you so much for joining us online. We will close out and have a good evening. God bless. All right, Brother Terry, I'll turn it over.